Vlogger Dome video on consciousness again. One more installment anyway, but probably will be more. So I took some notes. It's sort of related to the discussion with Piero about when awareness, consciousness, the ability to feel most specifically, to have emotions, feelings, desires, that this sensation stuff that we are experiencing, when that occurs in the animal life form. And I argue that it's all neurology, that it's an illusion. I said it before and I'll say it again. I'll actually post that same remark again because it comes up. So anyway, some of these notes will be redundant. They'll be below, and the other videos have notes, and eventually I'll compile them into something more coherent. So the question is, what is awareness or consciousness? What forms possess it? So I already paraphrased that. It's just an illusion, but one hell of an illusion, as Einstein would say about time. I think consciousness is the same kind of thing. Our brain creates a theater. It creates a mechanism that allows this presentation to take place. And even though it feels really big, maybe it is big, in my opinion, in terms of its meaning weight, in terms of its substance, but it is in fact just something created inside a brain. It's a projection. It's a hologram. It's an artifact. Artifact maybe isn't even the right word. It's just a phenomenon created by the physical mechanism, by the electricity and the chemistry and the arrangement of it. It creates this illusion, this mirage of an identity and a qualitative sense of attraction and repulsion, of friendly, unfriendly, of comforting, discomforting, aggravating, harassing, repulsive, and the opposite, compliant, and what's the word I'm looking for? Not seductive, but something that pulls you in, that you find compatible and comforting. So anyway, hardware needed to create it. Okay, so that's the argument I'm making, that you need this brain thing. You need a lot of neurons in chemistry, some kind of chemistry in there, whatever the parts, the hypothalamus, whatever the things are, these pieces of hardware inside of our brain that are able to create the projector, the screen, however you want to look at it, the stage, the lights, but the theater, the thing that contains us in our watching our reality and experiencing it. So we're now able to experience, because of the illusion, the hologram generated inside of our brain, the representation of reality that's brought into us, and it's tagged with little cactus thorns. You could say, like, some piece of reality will come into me, as a vision, and my brain will recognize it, and it'll recognize it as something that has little spikes on it, or as something very soft and warm, or something very, passive. I guess I'm arguing that also, there are videos that what really the brain does is it first creates the negative state, the harassment state, and then it takes the thorns off. So it's like it brings something into me, and it just has a relative thorniness. And so things that aren't thorny, we automatically assume are good. But it's just an assumption because they're not thorny. They're not a problem, so therefore they're good. That kind of thing. It's relieving of a discomfort. This is how we derive pleasure. Relieving of tensions and aggravations and frustrations. Negative emotions are relieved, dissipated, evaporated, and that creates the sensation of well-being. Infinite feedback loop. I've talked about that before, but it's like the sound going out of crazy in a microphone. But it's probably some kind of mechanism like that, because that's what our brain is doing. It's feeding back on top of itself. It's projecting on top of reality through the mechanism of our brain, and likely through that process it creates the illusion of this comfortable or uncomfortable state. Uncomfortable state. Again, the negative is probably the only thing that really exists, and it's just the elimination of the negative that creates the illusion of a positive. So that's probably another mechanism that I should try to use verbiage that acknowledges that truth. So when I say feels good, I'm probably just saying relieves us of feeling bad. But that does sound a little unintuitive, but I probably should get into the habit of it because I think it's the truth. Alright, the evolution of reflexes into qualitative feelings. So yeah, the brain is doing this thing where it's taking reflexes. That's all neurology is. That's all the function is. It's just a knee-jerky kind of thing. One end gets a stimulus, the other end projects that stimulus into a behavior or a chain reaction that triggers a Rube Goldberg chain reaction of eventual action. So we have the reflexes, the learned reflexes of muscle memory and action, and we have the reflexes that trigger those. And somewhere in this formula of our brains was this mechanism of the first reflex being the reflex of state of mind, mood, temperament, disposition. I feel comfortable, I feel uncomfortable. I am anxious, I am relaxed. I am, repulsed or attracted. The relative slowness of human conscious perceptions indicates the illusion requires a lot of brain work to create. Well, here, I forgot this one. Oh, I forgot this one. I'm tired. Anyway, value designation required for affirmative learning. So I put it in bold because establishing value is what feelings essentially do. And they create a mechanism to do that through, which is this creation of a negative state and then a positive state relative to the negative state by relieving the negatives. And so that way it can assess whether something is good or bad, whether an adventure we have was positive or negative, in that sense of did it migrate us from a negative state to a positive state. And if it did, then we learn that that was a good behavior. And if it did the opposite, then we learn that was a bad behavior, and we start associating or tagging things and putting them into those two categories of good or bad. And this is a fundamental, necessary aspect of intelligence to be able to learn, is to be able to assess the goodness or the badness. It's like you can't really do logic unless you know good logic and bad logic. You have to be able to label them. The creation of inhibition. Yeah, that's the real core of it too. I think it's a survival mechanism, was the fact that emotions can coexist with each other, that these sensations can blend into each other and do some math. We can be hungry and horny and afraid. We can be more than one thing at one time, and it can have a collective impact on our disposition and make us tend one way or another, and then more information will make the decision for us, but it will create a mood, a blending of circumstantial reactions. So our different senses can sense different things, be in different states of being, and we, as a physical biological organism, can be in different states. We can be full, or we can be physically sick or some other kind of thing, and that can change how we react to the world because of how it changed our disposition, our mood. The relative slowness of human conscious perceptions indicates the illusion requires a lot of brain work to create. So the fact that it's, our brain does move really slow. If you're occupied in your consciousness, the fact that this video is going to be 15 minutes long is just sort of an indication that it takes us quite a bit of time to construct sentences and communicate ideas and concepts. And so the brain is doing a lot of work to organize, to have these categories, to assess them, and to put value weight on them. To do all of this stuff is not happening very fast. The electricity is moving really fast, the chemistry is moving really fast, but yet our consciousness is rolling along pretty slowly. And even our reflexive reactions are much quicker. My fingers are moving right now by my subconscious in manners that are just way too fast for me to ever be aware of exactly what they're doing. Okay. The fact that consciousness can be focused, senses can be turned on and off, indicates that it does not exist in the parts themselves. So obviously we can sort of focus our intention. Our eyes can focus on particular events, but we can also focus our senses. So when I'm busy talking and doing this video, I'm not very aware of my feet or my elbows or my shoulders or my back or my behind or some other part of my body. And yet I can change that perspective. A program runs and it changes the focus. And if it wants to assess something else, I can all of a sudden become aware of these other parts. So obviously the consciousness is kind of not coming from the parts, it's coming from the higher deliberator. The higher part of the brain is making the decision about what consciousness will be conscious of. And the consciousness isn't in the parts or in the senses. The consciousness is delegating attention, and therefore it must have control over the consciousness. So I think that's an intuitive or inductive or deductive conclusion that we can deduce from this circumstance, that the consciousness is likely a function of the higher order, not the lower order of our brain function. Feelings only have use as something to be thoughtfully reacted to. This is important. So our brain first reacts by creating feelings. The first reaction our brain has to something is to create a sensation or to focus our attention, turn our head. So we have this reflexive response, this chemical reaction. The color red creates they've statistically found, creates a chemistry inside of you that automatically prepares you for hostility just because it's the color red, and you associate with fire and blood and violence. And so it automatically has a chemical reaction that creates a mood inside of you, a temperament, a disposition, an anxiousness, just because it's the color red. And that's the first reaction your body does. And so now it reinterprets red through that new sensation. And that's what I'm arguing, this feedback mechanism. It keeps feeding back on itself, and it keeps not only modifying the feelings, but it's registering the connections to these other conceptions in your memory that are labeled similarly, that have the same kind of coding of emotional response, and they'll be fed into your disposition, and they'll be part of the mechanism. And whatever's tied to the thoughts you're thinking, the C word connections, if this word car and it's red, then red car goes through your brain, and all the associations that match red car, the C word car might even be the word couch, and whatever's tied to couch in terms of an emotion will also be fed into your state of being. So your state of being is going to be blending your emotional state, your feeling state is going to be blended by the feelings connected to these old ideas and these memories. So you'll be remembering and feeling the memories as you are contemplating the thing. For example, most of our most aggressive feelings only arrive after we have taken unconscious reflexive action. So this is another part of that just indicates that it's not a conscious process. That, if your hand's burning, you usually reflexively react. Your eyes react very quickly to even the tiniest bit of stimulus. You're not conscious of the thing hitting your eye. Your eye just automatically reacts, and so there's no consciousness involved in that reaction. So if you look at lower forms of life, they certainly aren't doing anything more complicated than what my eyelid is doing. My eyelid is doing something a lot more complicated than their behavior, and yet my eyelid is functioning completely outside the realm of my consciousness. I'm not conscious of my eyelid defending my eyes. Alright, physical phenomena can look or seem self-generated and deliberate, but just be physical dynamics requiring no conscious interpretation. So again, people like to say it seems or it looks, and these are just not that's just what it is. Yeah, it seems and it looks, but that doesn't mean anything. It's not. Okay, so because something's behaving in a manner that looks a little bit sophisticated, that looks like something you would do, doesn't mean it's doing it through a same mechanism that you're doing it. It could just be acting reflexively, without any conscious phenomenon at all, without any feeling state, and then an interpretation of that feeling state into a reaction state. It's just knee-jerking, and you're assuming because you have knee-jerks and you have jerks that are more complicated than knee-jerks, you're just associating those two things, and that's just kind of an error in thinking. Looking and seeing just aren't good words. Can't live on that stuff. I'll put seeing, change that. M, that's better. So anyway, guys, so we got dream state is life practice. So that's another part of consciousness. It's very different. Obviously, our brain is able to, because it has a model in here, to create illusionary adventures, and to give us basically life practice, to force us into circumstances in our dreams, bizarre circumstances, and challenge us to deal with those, and in a sense give us practice for when the real thing happens in the real world. You know, there's certain things that are suspended in terms of our reactions, physical reactions, and so there's this whole, it happens in a safe environment where it can't get out of control, so the brain still gets its rest, the body gets its rest, but it can still do some practice while it's, you know, wasting time hiding from the dark. So anyway, enough of video. So, yeah, Piro has conceded some of these points, so I didn't make this as aggressively as I was going to, because I really don't want to waste my time arguing. I think people ought to appreciate that we have 100 billion neurons for a reason. It's because consciousness is not easily created. You don't, it just doesn't happen in anything that's reproducing itself. It doesn't happen in anything that's got little hairs on its surface and swims. It happens in complex neurological networks that are specifically composed in specific ways, and that have derived that state from an evolutionary history. So, yeah. Maybe it starts with insects. I say it starts with something that can learn. Insects can do a little bit of learning, so it probably starts in something like an insect, but probably doesn't exist in something like a coral or a clam. But I'm sort of just guessing at that line. Where the first ouch began is not too easy to establish, but we know what kind of life form it was probably in, and that it probably wasn't in something that didn't have neurons in a ganglia. Okay, well, that's enough of the video. Thank you very much.